Good morning, everyone, and it's an absolute pleasure to be here at the inaugural NewMR conference. My name's Graeme Lawrence. It's good morning from me. I'm in Manchester in the UK, and as I said, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you this morning. We've also got some really interesting papers around the NewMR conference, and a lot of them are giving you a potential vision of the future and a perspective on the skills researchers are going to require in the future. My paper today, I think, is going to hopefully give you a sense of certainly the future, I feel, and some observations on that, but maybe a little bit of a stepping stone to that future as well, because I'm actually anchoring it around a specific case study of a retailer in the UK. And as you can see from the title is Listening is Only Half of the Story. A number of you will have seen my synopsis that went in for this paper. Thanks to all those of you who voted for me. It's a pleasure to be talking around this particular title. So what am I talking about when I'm saying that listening is only half of the story? Well, listening is at the heart of this, and it's a key phrase that's really kicking around the NewMR arena overall at the moment. But listening, if we think about it, is something that has been important to understanding the human condition for hundreds of years. If you think back to Marco Polo and all his work around the observational diaries that we're talking about many centuries ago, you're obviously looking at a situation there where he was observing and listening to different people at that particular time. And this understanding of the human condition for me is something that's always been important and something that's going to lie at the heart of my presentation. The other picture I've got on the slide here is of the work done by the Mass Observation Group in the UK. This was a group that was formed in the 1930s who paid a team of investigators to go into a variety of public situations to conduct investigations into the human condition. And they went into various scenarios, recording people's behaviour and conversation in as much detail as possible. And they really were trying to get at the heart of the human condition to understand how people's lifestyles were playing out at that point in time. And this is something for me that is really at the heart of what I want to talk to you about today, is that what we've got happening in the world isn't necessarily a new phenomena, but it's kind of a changing phenomena. And in the sense that the active and passive listening that the likes of the Mass Observation Group got involved in back in the 30s onwards is something that we're grappling with now, and now within a new kind of context overall. Interestingly, the Mass Observation Group tried to generally observe and stay in the background, but they felt quite challenged by that, and that active listening and the movement into prompting and actually talking to people as well became an interesting challenge to strike that balance between listening to people without them realizing and actually engaging them in conversation and discourse. So we're obviously in a situation where listening is important to us as a research industry. I don't think anyone would deny that. I think where we've ended up as a research industry, and I think events like this will challenge some of these situations, is the fact that we've become too closely anchored our listening skills into asking questions and working on our preconceived ideas. It's been a nice kind of comfy environment for us as researchers over the last sort of 50 years or so to have a question and answering dynamic and frame of reference for us. But what's happening overall in terms of the web, and certainly within the last 5 years or so, has really changed that. The whole participative web and social media world is shaking up our requirements for listening and our requirements as a research industry to have different frames of reference. It's a shift change. We're having to move from that kind of active environment where we really took control of the situation to thinking about how we can do passive listening and how we can do different forms of active listening. And these are really rising to the fore, and it's really challenging the ratio between that kind of questions and answers, prompting and unprompting environment. It's even led some, and I believe this was coined by the organizer of this event, Ray Pointer, to use phrases such as, why ask some when you can listen to all? In essence, we're saying here, do we really need to be using those question and answer frames of references and dynamics that we've used over the last 50 years or so, or are we in a situation where we can actually seek out the answers that we require as researchers without actually having to use that kind of more rigid model? Now, I'm no social media expert and I wouldn't claim to be one, but I do feel that I have a good handle on the impact that social media is having and how important the participative web is to us as researchers, and that's why I believe events like this are really, really important. This isn't challenging our skill sets as researchers, it's also challenging our skill sets as marketeers as a whole. As brands enter into social media and they enter into these environments to understand what they can get from it as a brand, it's challenging us overall to understand, well, what role have we got to play? How do we take part here, etc. And now I don't need to tell you about the rise of social media and the sorts of numbers that are involved, but it's really a case that brands are undoubtedly wanting to go more and more into this space when you think of the numbers of participants and interactions that they can get involved in there. So what does it mean to a brand? As I said, I'm no social media expert, I don't think, but I do understand that brands in the social media world is becoming increasingly important. You take this model that I've got up here, we're looking at social media channels, the consumer's perceptions of brands and the brand itself. How do these interact? Well, in simple terms, I think we're looking at two different ways of looking at this. The first is the fact that a brand can try and own this data. They can try and generate this data in their own way. So a very simple example is it's very easy for a brand to set up its own Facebook page, its own Twitter account. They're starting this particular point of reference and trying to own, in inverted commas, this content. But obviously customers are going to have perceptions of the brand in this environment overall. And this is going to be part of the interaction. Beyond that though, obviously the consumers out there are generating content about brands away from these environments that are generated by the brands themselves. So we are in a situation where user-generated content is happening, and a brand is probably going to be incredibly and increasingly interested in this type of discourse that is out there on the participative web. And overall, the brand needs to think about both of these particular areas. And as a researcher, as I say, I'm sort of looking at it from two particular perspectives here. And the case study I'm going to come on to today is going to highlight the sort of left-hand side of this diagram, but I'm also going to make some observations on the right-hand side as well. My first observation would be that if you are going to get involved in this environment, and it's increasingly important to do so, you really shouldn't be entering into the social media world as a brand without a plan. It's actually quite frightening, the amount of people and brand owners who are willing to admit that they are having a social media presence and don't actually have a brand policy in place. There was a piece of work by e-consultancy done within the last few months which suggested that almost 6 in 10 companies do not have a social media policy in place. And there was a survey, quite a large survey of marketeers in the States. Now, one brand who has moved into this particular arena and actually taken on board this requirement of a plan is Coca-Cola. And Linda Cronin, who I've never met, and maybe somebody on the line have heard of or have met, has a lovely title which highlights how important this is to them. So she's Director of Media and Interactive Integrated Communications for Coca-Cola North America. And she said in a recent conference, you can't enter this space without a strategic plan in place. So what forms a strategic plan for a brand within the social media space? Well, from my perspective, listening is key to this strategic plan. It has to be. You have to consider what you want to achieve from your listening policy, what you want to actually try and get out of being in this space, and then monitor it and listen to what's coming back from the discourse. I've got a couple of examples on the screen for you here. They're just kind of small examples, but they're sort of interesting examples within the brand-generated space overall. In the top left, we've got the UK retailer Next. They're a fashion retailer here in the UK. I'm going to come on to a little case study about them at the end as well. And this is them actually just getting some feedback from some of their members on their Facebook page and making a real effort to go back to that particular fan, as it was at the time, people like this now, and actually say to them, you know, that's really helpful for that feedback, thank you very much. So keeping an ear out to it, listening to it, a kind of sort of an active listening model, but really a kind of lighter touch, if you like. An interesting one on the other example is H&M. This is something from their Facebook page where they've actually generated a conversation and a discourse about where they should open stores next. Now, I think they'll have probably done this largely from a PR strategy perspective, but it is interesting to note that they've got 1,400 people getting involved in this discourse. And I think this might be an interesting precursor to some of the things that may happen in years to come. And it will be interesting to look back on a presentation like this in a couple of years to see how that's moved forward for us as researchers and how we've embraced and understood this particular mechanic in more detail. Now obviously the model I highlighted earlier suggested not just brand-generated content, so not just a brand owning its own Facebook page, Twitter account, YouTube channel or whatever. It's also highlighting the fact that there's going to be a lot of noise from consumer-generated content as a whole around brands. And I think sort of beyond this brand-generated is there's a real requirement within the social media strategy overall to have an always-on, hence the on button being on in the diagram, an always-on approach to this listening strategy. You've got to be on top of it all the time. You've got to be listening to this buzz and always monitoring what customers and consumers are saying about your brands. And obviously this has spawned the growth of buzz research agencies and buzz specialist agencies overall, those who are going to data mine for you, web scrape, etc. Hence the little picture to the side of this. Now, from our perspective, a lot of us are from a fairly traditional market research background, and this actually brings into play a huge questioning area around ethics and the ethics of doing this kind of work. Now, I don't want to get into this in too much detail, and in actual fact, we're, as an agency, our chairman is helping SMR with some guidelines that they're putting together on this. But I'm just going to highlight 3 key ethical points from my perspective, and then I'm going to give you a quick example that kind of relates to these 3 points. And these 3 points are as follows. When people are putting up content on there, they're actually generating verbatims. To what extent, as researchers, can we pick up those verbatims and use them for our own purposes or for our clients' purposes? It's the first kind of point I'm going to make. The second point is, when people are placing content onto various forums, various environments on the participative web, what are the T's and C's of those particular sites? Are we breaking any of the T's and C's by actually going onto those environments and taking out any of the information and using it for our purposes? The third part I'd highlight as well is the ability to actually link to personal information. Now, if you take a verbatim, it is possible, and it's quite easy actually, when you see some examples in play, to actually link this to personal information of people. Where does that sit around data protection for various groups of us around the world overall? And as I said, we're quite heavily involved with SMR in trying to help them on some guidelines on this front. I'm just going to give you a quick example of something that appeared in the last month or so, which I think kind of highlights those 3 areas. There was a particular forum called Patients Like Me in the States who noticed some activity going on with people entering the forum and seeming to have a kind of a very high interest level at that particular point. They realized that actually it was Nielsen Buzz Metrics who were on there, and they were actually sort of taking some of the commentary and trying to use it as part of their buzz analysis. Now, I'm not going into the rights and wrongs of this now, but it's interesting that one of the main chap who was actually highlighted through the media on this particular piece, he felt quite violated by this, and it was for those kind of 3 reasons that I highlighted before. A particular comment of his was taken and used. He also felt that the Patients Like Me site did have some terms and conditions in place that may have been breached. And he was certainly concerned about the fact that it's actually very easy to pick up his commentary on people like on the Patients Like Me site and link it to some of his personal data due to the nature of his login on that particular site. So as I said, I'm not going to go any further on that, but I think that's a very interesting one, and I'm sure it'll probably be a hot topic at future NewMR events as well. Moving on, let's go to what we think we can do, and this is an approach from us which we feel is within the boundaries of the kind of what we're looking to play out here in terms of listening. We've developed a model at Virtual Surveys which is looking at the open sources around how a brand is generating content in its social media spaces. And the model is quite straightforward in the sense of highlighting content that's put up there by the brand. It's highlighting the reach of that content that's put up there by the brand. So if the brand is putting status updates or comments on its Facebook page, the reach of that is how many people are saying they're a fan or are people like this as it is now. The next part of the model is actually getting a handle on how much retweeting, how much reposting, how much links to comments are being made within these environments. And we model this work within what we've called a social media presence model for brands to see how they're getting on at a particular moment in time. Now, to go back to my title of my piece today, listening is only half of the story, we have found within this work at the moment that that can only take us so far. And we believe that more traditional models of market research need to come into play here and will continue to do so for a good period of time. So let me explain in some more detail. If you look at the model in terms of some of the outputs that we get, this is quite a busy chart. But the point of this really, guys, is to highlight that we have a competitive landscape here for a number of different brands. And we've taken retail brands both in the UK and beyond. And we're highlighting here, based on that content, reach and engagement modeling scenario, who's doing well at a particular time in the relative context within the market space. Okay. Now, the way we use this data, really, as much as anything, is to highlight when there's been shifts in relative terms. So the slide I've put up there next is highlighting the fact that we had an increase in the activity and the engagement levels at a particular point in time. Now, what we do with that data is then we go back to those social media platforms and have a look to try and understand and hypothesize why that's happened. Why have they had a peak or a trough? What's gone on? Has there been a particular promotion? Has there been a particular piece of discourse? Has there been a particular type of person that appears to have come into that environment at that time? And through this aggregated data, we can generate a variety of hypotheses to give to the client overall. We can also take it to other sources that are aggregated that aren't necessarily personal, but we can see things like interconnections as well. So at the heart of this lovely map is the Next UK retail official site, but it highlights also where the members of that site, where the fans of that site, who else are they connecting with, what other stuff are they getting involved in, and this can really help to provide some of the answers too. But as I say, it only takes you so far, and from our experience, unfortunately, listening in this sense isn't enough. Yes, it's an active listening model, but we probably need to go back to looking at asking questions and actually trying to generate a different discourse with a different frame of reference. And this is where what we currently call primary research comes to bear more starkly. And for Next, the UK fashion retailer, we did exactly this. We were in a scenario with them where we were giving them a sense of how they were doing by doing the social media presence modeling, but they needed to know more than that. They needed to know more about who they were reaching. They needed to know more to understand the engagement. Why were they engaging? What were they hooking onto? What particularly was of interest to them? And more importantly, what impact was this having on these particular consumers? Were they actually changing their image in line with the strategy, because they did have a strategy of sorts, to go back to the social media strategy point, and was this having an impact on their behaviour? Now, I won't go into it in a lot of detail now, but the important thing to highlight here was that yes, we did conduct, I'll put it in inverted commas, traditional research, if you like. But the important thing was we actually conducted this research using a methodology that is a lot more aligned to the social media world. We used our short-term online community platform to conduct a short-term community with a group of people who we invited across from the Facebook page to say, come on, how's about coming over here to a very similar type environment that you'll find very intuitive, and having a chat about how you feel about this particular communication offer from Next. What's it doing for you? How do you feel about it? And interestingly, a lot of the tools that we use within that environment are actually quite akin to some of the listening tools that you would possibly use if you were doing buzz work, to understand what were the prominent kind of phrases that were coming out in terms of the discourse as a whole. But we were recreating that discourse with that research agenda at the heart of it. And it was a really interesting study to conduct from that perspective. If you're interested in the study in any more, there is some more information, and I'm happy to share it with you if you wanted to contact me. But in the spirit of time, I've just got a couple of final observations for you. To go back to the phrase I mentioned earlier, why ask someone you can listen to all? I think it's a really interesting phrase and a really good one to help challenge the parameters that we're currently working within. The reality for me is we still need to do both. But we need to reframe what we're doing. We need to think about the methods that we're using when it comes to the question and answer framework, And we need to also think about reframing and framing some of the listening approaches that we're using when it comes to the discourse that's on the web as a whole. The tools are becoming increasingly sophisticated for this kind of work, and I think that will help this reframing process. But I think this is going to be an interesting one to watch, in particular around things such as ethics. But if we go back to Marco Polo and we go back to the mass observation group, I think the important thing is it's reframing the fact that we are trying to get to the bottom of the human condition, and that can only be a good thing. Thank you very much, and I welcome your questions.